Welcome to this episode of Level with Emily Reese, featuring a chat with composer Andy Rohrmann, aka Scientific or Scientific American. And Andy and I talk about two scores today. We talk about a game that came out a little bit earlier this year, 2022, called Gibbon Beyond the Trees. And we talk about another game that came out last year called JETT, The Far Shore. So we talk about Gibbon and JETT. But some of the other things that Andy's worked on, you might know his music from Oxenfree. It's very popular from Night School Studios, and he's worked on Night School's other games like After Party, Next Stop Nowhere, and he's currently working on Oxenfree 2, which is supposed to come out next year in 2023. So we'll talk about JETT first, and then we'll talk about Gibbon. Before we get to that, please be sure to join us on Discord. You'll find a link down in the show notes. It doesn't cost anything. Come join the conversation about music in games and just games in general, sometimes cats and dogs and other pets. So that'd be fun to have you join us there. Again, the link's down in the show notes. If you can support us on Patreon, we'd be ever so grateful. And subscribe to this YouTube channel. Important note about this particular chat that's on YouTube is that we don't put music in here. I leave that out of the YouTube video, and you can only hear the musics in context in the audio podcast, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts. And it's highly recommended. That's the recommended format for Level with Emily, is the podcast version, just because then you hear the music samples. So yeah, all right. Well, here's Andy. And again, first we talk about JETT, The Far Shore.
JETT, The Far Shore is a sci-fi adventure, and you play as a jet pilot exploring a new alien planet.
And so it's very beautiful, very huge spacescapes, right? Just lots of space, I guess. Yeah. Space and about in space. So, the soundtrack for this one is very broad in terms of its instrumentation and lots of beautiful vocals and the like. I do feel like the very first track on the soundtrack, we could probably just talk about for an entire episode. I mean, it's like 15 minutes of it kind of reminded me of like an orchestral overture, right? Just kind of laying everything out there. So talk to me about that.
Well, that is exactly how it started. Since it was such a long project, I think there was a point, and I think I instigated it, where we had a lot of music and we had a lot of it based on scenes or, areas of the game that we've been working on. And I just felt the need to just kind of encapsulate it, to say, okay, what are we doing here? Let me gather a lot of this to just kind of like a vibe check, after a few years of working. So I just put it together on my own time, just to say, hey, Craig, this is Craig Adams of Super Brothers. Like, here's kind of an overview of, where I'm at with how things feel, which was all very positive. And so that was a conscious effort to create something that encompassed the vibe so far, the story so far of the game. That included the ambiences, so sound design as well, of like, we really want to capture what going to, a new planet would be like. So one of the first things is, what does it sound like? And so that was very important. So that's how that came about, was as an overture, was just kind of gathering bits and pieces of this project we had done to date. The working title for that was the Topography Suite, and that was again intentional titling. Like, topography was about this planet and what it looked like. It wasn't a character theme, it wasn't a theme, it was just like, what does it feel like? And so the working title of Topography really, really felt good. And so then that sat with us, however long it is, I'm not even sure. 15 minutes, 28 seconds, because I have my cheat sheet here. It just stuck with us, and it was something we'd come back to. And then by the time the game was coming together, Craig was like, we got to put this in, because, it's exactly that. an overture to what's to come. And my only reference for that is in film was as a kid seeing Lawrence of Arabia and just having the screen open, but then nothing on screen. It was just music. And I just thought that was the coolest thing. Like, you know, you get, I don't know how long that overture is, but, you know, 10 minutes before anything even comes on screen, I thought was really impactful. So we kind of took that idea and used it.
Yeah. Yeah. I really love the palette too. Will you talk a little bit about the, you know, the choices that you made to, you know, sonically color the landscape then?
Yeah. I started with a really rudimentary metaphor, which is we have, you know, ostensibly humans leaving their planet and going to a new one. And I really felt that dichotomy of, I think that's the right word, of explorers that are us versus the complete unknown, which would be, you know, manifested in this game as this new planet full of new life forms. So I thought of, I would say, more genre typical feelings of humans and heroism that you hear in film, which is usually big orchestras. So I started to lean towards orchestral, more familiar instruments as being the voice of the explorers, and then more synthetic, synthesis-based or alien sounds, less familiar sounds, being the sound of this new planet. And again, kind of stealing from some of my favorite work was kind of stealing from Solaris and the idea of this alien planet is the alien. So I thought of it as the voice of the planet as a whole. And so we started with that as being, when we're in kind of the shoes of the humans and their heroism and exploration, we get the very symphonic kind of rah, rah, rah typical stuff. But as they delve into this alien world, that's when it gets weird. And so that's another thing we very intentionally did, is when you drop down, that all that orchestral stuff is gone and it's just kind of weird, creepy drones until you, as the character, kind of get your bearings and get back on your feet. So that's kind of, it definitely faded as, you know, 10 years of production progressed. But that was the general idea, was like on one side, orchestral based stuff, and on the other, for the aliens, the, you know, kind of unidentifiable synthetic sounds.
I absolutely loved the harp. Like, what made you decide to include so much harp, you know?
Yeah, because I like it. And that's the way a lot of this worked.
Well,
we
sure.
definitely had, weirdly, we had a lot of musical references. You know, we talk about film scores, a lot of film scores, and then I did a lot of research on orchestral music that pulls from the same mythology and histories that this game does, which would be Eastern Europe, Western Asia, you know, the history of the peoples of those regions. And then, you know, I went back to the Russian composers of the late 1800s who kind of did the same thing. They wanted their own identity apart from Europe. And so they essentially looked east, said, oh, well, we'll take some of this, you know, air quotes, exoticism, and make, you know, a Russian voice. And so I kind of did the same thing for this as an influence, but then obviously then coupled with, I'd say, contemporary and just, you know, film scoring and that style, because I love it. Not just contemporary, but even, you know, further back, just the drama of it. And I think that's something that Craig really liked as well and was really fun to explore. And, you know, coming back to what the question was, that's where these things came from. It's like, well, I really like that harp thing there. And then I'll put some harp in. Does Craig like that? Oh, that's cool. Flutes, there's a lot of flute in it. And just all these instruments that were, you know, they're components of orchestral writing anyway. So I just played with the ones I liked the most. So yeah, so I would say harp isn't something that pulled from any specific culture, but it definitely came from yeah, it's a drama of, I don't know, Tchaikovsky or whatever, the heyday of romanticism, where there's like Debussy and stuff, like let's be big and flowery, I guess you could say.
Yeah. I mean, and those Russian nationalists definitely made a name for themselves by doing that, right? By saying, we're going to create a sound and it's going to be this.
Yes.
And I mean, and it was hugely popular, right? And, it's still orchestral favorites that you hear any major symphony play every year, will come from, some of it will come from that. So yeah, that stuff's amazing. Yeah, I mean, you do this really great kind of harp. I wouldn't really call it a cadenza as much, but I guess it's a cadenza in that, it's like around the 6-minute mark in that opening piece, which, by the way, is called Soak in Brine. That's the actual title of it.
Yes.
Everybody drops out and the harp just does this lovely kind of melismatic statement. It's very brief, and it's not, when I think of a cadenza in the traditional sense, I think of a soloist being like really bombastic and flashy and virtuosic, and this isn't that. This is just a little like, hey, I'm going to harp here for a minute.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really lovely how everything just kind of drops out and it's just harp and choir for a minute, and I really liked that.
Well, I think one of the things, as a non-educated writer working in orchestral music, I don't know how to play these things. So, but and again, it's just like, that is what it is. It's not necessarily like a badge of honor or anything. I just haven't gone through that. But I always think of things from a sound design angle and tones and textures and how these things interplay. So one of my favorite contemporary composers is John Luther Adams, and I was really lucky. I got to see the world debut of Become Desert.
Oh wow.
Where there's bits of the orchestra placed in the balconies, the choir's behind you can't even see them, and it really hits home that it's all about these textures and their movement, and it's not about virtuosity, like check out this piano line, this guy's great, right? Stuff. It's much more about just like, hey, these instruments sound badass. And I love it. And so it's a lot of that. And there's the freedom of working in kind of that orchestral construct, or, you got all these instruments. I would say somewhat unconstrained in a way, because so much of it's sample based, that I can throw in, this texture is really neat. And I don't have to worry, since we're not live recording, like, oh no, that's another, we don't have an oboe, we can go, yep, I do. And while, again, I don't get to harness the virtuosity of a real musician, I get to play with those textures. And so that's where a lot of that comes from, is just plugging things in, adding and removing to get the textures that sound good and good together. And if they're still doing a lot of the traditional stuff of chord progressions and bringing in a melody and swapping that melody and giving it to this other instrument to get some other feel. But a big part of it, again, going back to that concept of why the working title was topography, is it's like we're working with, we talk about ocean waves a lot, and sounds coming and going, in this way. And so that was one of the prime drivers of how all of this worked, is these textures. And hopefully you get to the point where you can kind of lose yourself in it and just like enjoy the feeling instead of the specifics.
Yes, definitely. And of course, choir is a big part of that. So I'm curious how that all worked. Because maybe you had a large mixed chorus, but I don't know that you did. So how did that happen?
Well, so this gets back to the kind of budget. Is this, we're an indie game kind of scrapping along for so many years. We talked about like, well, where will we spend money? And I'm pretty good at harnessing computer stuff and making it feel organic and real.
Yes.
But the one thing I have no skill for is the human voice. On so many levels, I'm terrible at it. So I said, if we're going to spend any money, I want to spend it on singing, because that's
Nice.
the thing I need the most help from a writing standpoint, from a performance standpoint, to a I just don't know what the hell I'm doing standpoint. But we had an idea of what we wanted, and it was it started, I think both of us, this is Craig Adams and I, are fans of The Thin Red Line. It's a Terrence Malick film, and in that there are Polynesian or Pacific Islander choirs that are really, really unique. But one of the things that's unique about them is it's essentially a pidgin English Christian choirs, but kind of run through this filter of the explorers who went there and the missionaries who went there, and then the cultures that they interacted with. And so this curious choir sound is very, very unique. This is getting a little off topic here, but there's even specific island. There's only like 500 or 600 people who live there who actually do pitch or key shifts mid-song.
Oh, wow.
It's Rapa Iti, I believe. I could be getting this wrong, and I can send you references afterwards. But it is the most disconcerting thing, because they'll actually entire choir slide from one pitch to another and then continue singing. And so it sounds like somebody's slowing down a record.
Wow.
It's really, really amazing. Anyway, I digress. So as we did more research, I noticed the similarities between the Pacific Islander choirs and American choirs. It's called shape singing.
Yeah, shape note singing.
Note singing. And I was like, man, this stuff is really, really similar. And so I did as much research as I could about how and why these cropped up and they're so similar. And it was basically like, as religion traveled and missionaries traveled, this is essentially, I think the word is naive writing. So they're like, well, we don't know how to read music, so we ascribe shapes to things, and then the singers are kind of in a circle or in a square, and one person leads it, and it's very essentially like, for lack of a better term, kind of primitive. But that to me is like, that's the real shit. Like I love the purity of it. So coincidentally, in researching this stuff, I was like, well, this stuff's amazing. How could we possibly pull it off? I came into contact with Priscilla Snow via Twitter, and they've done really amazing music for scores and soundtracks. And so I was just a fan of their stuff that was on Bandcamp. And somehow we got on the subject of this style of music. And Priscilla's like, oh, I know, not only do I know what that is, I've sung it. And my great grandfather wrote the book, literally wrote the book on this style of singing. Wow. And I was like, you gotta be shitting me. So at the time, Priscilla lived in Seattle. So we were actually able to meet face to face. And I said, this is what I want to do. What do you think of that? And they were like, oh, yeah, I could knock this out. No problem. And then the pandemic hit. And they ended up moving to Montreal, but became really involved in the project to the point where Priscilla designed the language that's spoken in the game
about that.
And that the kernel of that was writing this piece of music. And so we described the scene. This is what it is. The explorer's going to leave. This is their essentially spiritual goodbye that the whole family and tribe sings as the person leaves. And so, yeah.
And is that To the Stars?
Yeah.
Is that the name of that one? To the Stars. Yeah.
And that is Priscilla demoed it with their own voice, just multi-tracked. And I was like, this is great. How are we going to do this? So we started contacting singers we know, friends of friends. By that time, A Shell in the Pit was involved for sound design, so they helped find some folks. My friend James Wetzel is a throat singer, so he sang low parts. Because that was another thing. I was like, I want to incorporate some of that because we use it later in the game. Priscilla's in the choir. John Robert Matz is in the choir, and several of the voice actors are in the
Oh,
choir.
interesting. Okay.
So it was built piece by piece.
Yeah.
So everybody sang separately. I put together demos from all those bits to say this is how this will roughly sound. And then a Shell in the Pit set it up spatialized within the game. So as you move through that crowd, all of these voices are coming from the characters in the game, and you can walk around the crowd. It's the most
Wow.
it's the most impressive like implementation and writing. Everything about it is just I love.
Yeah.
And I was obviously very kind of involved in a producer aspect, but I didn't write it and didn't perform it. Just kind of we had this rough idea, and Priscilla really knocked it out of the park. Like really, really amazing work. And like I said,
yeah, go ahead.
Like I said, went on to design the language in the entire game. So this song was done first. And that was like, yeah, Craig was like, well, hell yeah, we want to turn this into the language for the game.
Another track where Priscilla is featured pretty heavily is it the Hymn Wave, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another really beautiful just demonstration of their voice, and that's a cool track. Do you want to talk about that one at all?
Yeah, so that came about, we discussed it as well, along with the main choir writing. There's this idea we had, again, that this planet has a voice. And so that was what, I don't know when Craig started calling it the hymn wave, but it became that, well, this is the tone. And I'd done some more synthetic things that are pulses, and that they're all in the game that are like, well, this is kind of how this thing breathes. And it was like, well, when it gets really weird, what's going on? And I think I had discussed that with Priscilla. We needed music for the interior of this thing. So that was essentially the second song that was worked on, but this was much more of being remixed. So I was like, and I got approval beforehand. I said, I want the main choir piece, I don't want to touch. Like, you do your thing. Everybody sounds great. I was like, but this one I'm going to fuck with a bunch. Is that okay? And Priscilla was like, oh yeah, that's amazing as well. So go for it. And so then it was, highly manipulating things and looping to get, a more ambient approach. And again, using that dichotomy I mentioned earlier of the voice of the humans versus the voice of the planet. And ironically, having a human voice as a component of that, which is, I don't want to get too deep into it, but one of my philosophies with this, and again, I'm stealing from Lem and Solaris, was that the way this planet is communicating with the humans is kind of trolling through them and spitting it back out. I think that's in Contact too, the Carl Sagan book, of like, oh, well, we're so far advanced from you, we're going to like manifest ourselves in some sort of human form. So it's kind of that. It's like saying, well, we'll take these voices. Singing is very important to these people who came here, so I'm going to sing it back to them. But then it's been distorted and kind of, droned out into what became known as the hymn wave.
Cool. Yeah, it's a really lovely piece. Talk to me about minimalism, if you would, and your experience with it, because some of these pieces are very like that era of the 60s and 70s in classical music and such. Yeah. So talk to me a little bit, especially JETT to Cosmodrome, which has great woodwinds in it, beautiful oboe and flute. So so talk to me a little bit about that, because it pops up in the score.
Yeah, sure. Well, I love that stuff too. I love all kinds of music, and like it's funny. The word minimalism became really important to me because I think of it. I mean, obviously, it's a kind of a codified style of orchestral music, as you mentioned. But I also use that word as a bigger thing. So John Luther Adams, perfect example of minimalism.
Yeah.
In a way, like I would say, notes on a page is minimalism, but in terms of these Reason performances, it's maximalism because it's a massive amount of performers. But I've always appreciated doing the kind of the axiom of doing more with less. So kind of, and I'm additive and subtractive when I write. I keep adding stuff and adding stuff. I'm like, oh, this would be cool. This would be cool. But then just as important is then subtracting things and realizing like, oh, well, this instrument, it's not the point anymore, or it's not adding something specific. So it's stripping things down to the bare essentials. So in terms of minimalism, like beyond it as that term, I do think of it like music wide, like who does a lot with a little, basically. And weirdly, this has nothing to do, I guess, with the music JETT, but I think of Portishead a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Is that song Machine Gun, which is basically like, it's so nothing and it's so good. Like I say nothing as a compliment. Like, how did they make something so good with so few elements? And so that is, something I strive towards as I'm throwing crap at the wall, is to like, no, pull it back to, what's the simplest it could be. That how it relates to some of the things I did in JETT is then how repetition is a part of that minimalism. Like it could be a simple figure and that just, it repeats, and maybe the repeats are offset from a different instrument doing something, but that tone, even though it's separate notes like an arpeggio, becomes almost a drone because it's like so persistent and consistent. So yeah, there's definitely some of that too. And I love loops. I come from kind of a background of, I've always loved sampled music, and like some of my favorite music is 100% sampled by, producers like the Bomb Squad, who they produce with noise a lot. So they did, I think their biggest thing was Public Enemy Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. And it is just, everybody else was going for a drum break off some record. They'd use the same record, but they're like, no, we'll use the weird squeaky saxophone part and we'll repeat that. And that really struck me as like, again, this is kind of that minimalism thing. It's like, they're not like playing a riff. They're creating textures with what other people would consider throwaway, or, like I said, I think, one of these songs, it is just the intro, kind of like almost like the saxophone clearing their throat, and they turn that into something central. So it's like mining that territory of repetition as well. It's just like, I love loops. And so ascribing that to something with that as the opposite, which is a lot of orchestral music, it's always going somewhere new. 15-minute long piece, it's always going somewhere new. Something new's happening. I'll get back to that melody eventually, but here's this new part. So I think it's almost an accident for me of balancing those two things of like, I love that variety and going places, but I also do like the concept of like something repeating over and over with subtle changes being a mantra sort of thing. Again, back to John Luther Adams. I really feel like knows that, like really nails that.
Yeah, this would be a good time to just very much encourage the listener to check out John Luther Adams, because there's just some really amazing, all his water series, the river, the ocean, all of those. He did a mensural canon a few years back, which is like a canon where the parts are either slowed down or sped up, so they're all playing simultaneously. I just hit my mic, but I was lucky enough to get to interview him back in an old job on stage about a premiere he did here in the Twin Cities, because of course St. Paul is right across the river, and they have a chamber orchestra there that's phenomenal, the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, and they premiered one of his pieces, and just an amazing person. So plug over for John Luther Adams. Go check him out. Well worth it. If you're ever wondering what modern classical music sounds like, there's an example, right? It just runs the gamut.
I was just gonna say, I have the weirdest series of plugs, don't I? Like John Luther Adams, Portishead, the Bomb Squad, Public Enemy.
And before we hit record, it was Steel Pole Bathtub, right?
So. And Steel Pole Bathtub. Yes.
Yeah, got to check that out. So this seems like a good time to ask then, because, you referenced a few times about, you kind of made some jokes about maybe like an uneducated, I can't remember how you said it, but, so inspired you then to really like dive into that and want to compose in that world if you perhaps felt like you didn't know how, or I don't really know how to ask the question unoffensively, but
no, like that's fine. So I did start out with very, earliest music stuff. I played trumpet and played jazz, just like, in school, like a lot of kids do. So I did read music, and I did, I got to the point where sight reading was no problem. And I kind of hit the point where it's like, well, I could keep going and like really try to be an excellent trumpet player, or I could say, screw this, I want to make my own stuff. Yeah. So I didn't stop immediately, but I bought a guitar and started playing drums, and it was just so much more fun than sitting down and playing somebody else's music. And so it wasn't deliberate, but then I just kind of forgot all of that and didn't have a music education. I grew up with it kind of like, well, do something real. And I kind of hit middle ground where I got to go to art school, but I went for industrial design. So very, location focused education, but I still got to be weird. So I kind of forgot all that and never came back to it beyond. To me, notation is super, super valuable for communication. That's how musicians and composers can talk to each other. That's awesome. And theory really helps a ton too, but if you don't have it, I think what I realized is so much of it is innate. And it's culturally very different depending on where someone is brought up and what music they listen to all the time. But a lot of those rules are rules because of that innateness, not because somebody decided like, well, we're going to do this. So tough. It was what was already happening anyway in folk music and sort of non-recorded music. And so they're just kind of like, oh, well, we got to write this down. And oh, shit, I get this. And that's what becomes theory. So it's it's playing in a lot of, what people could, more trained musicians and composers go, oh, you're doing this. And I don't know. But the reason I did it is because I heard somebody else did it and it sounded cool. Fine. And I might probably do just as much that, trained in theory folks would say, oh, that sucks. Like, why'd you do that? Or that's a rookie mistake or whatever. I don't know. I'm like, I'm sure those mistakes are in there, but I thought they sounded cool. And again, I'm so much about texture and sound design that the sound design of the things I'm hearing that's more important to me than like checking notes to see like, oh, the harp, speaking of harp, harps can't actually play that note, because they're pedaling and they're changing. I'm like, well, shit, sorry. If we did get to the point where it's like live, then I absolutely need to and want to collaborate with the musicians, because that world's fascinating to me as a lapsed musician of like, those little things, the range of something, or I can't play those two notes at once, or that's too fast. That piano part requires 15 fingers. What the fuck's wrong with you? Like, okay, we'll change it when that comes. But until then, I think there's, I don't want that to be a burden on, just making things sound cool.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's all just so fantastic. And I again, I'm glad you mentioned the harp again, because I love all the little times it pops out of the texture, and it does a really cool thing in let me find it. Jet to ground control. That's a fun one. It just does. It's a scale. It's stupid scale. Like, and you do that in Oxenfree too, by the way. And I'm maybe all other places, but I love that. I mean, there are loads of composers who just toss a scale in there, and I'm like sold. I love it. It's so simple and effective, and I loved that line in Jet to Ground Control. Yeah.
Well, a lot of this was just going for it.
Yeah.
And like I said, again, additive, subtractive, like adding things and like, hey, that sounds cool. And so that's where I think maybe more intuitive stuff pops up. Like, I just like the way that sounds. Or this, and again, guilty here, that's easier for me to play on a keyboard. You know, like that's one of the things. It's like, oh, that's too hard. And I do the thing where I cheat if something's super difficult, like I played and perform it at halftime and then double
for sure. Yeah.
You know, that kind of thing. But a lot of it will become like, yep, that's because that's the way my fingers worked and it sounded cool with other stuff. And there it exists.
You mentioned too about, you know, kind of this additive approach and stacking and things. And, you know, I think it's no surprise that that's how a lot of video game music is constructed in general, right? Because you're adding layers to up intensity and things like that. And so things come in. So I'm sure this will come up again in Gibbon because when we talk about that, I'll save it. We'll talk about that in Gibbon too. But but in JETT, you know, there are a lot of examples of this happening. But one of my favorites here is called is it Love the Dreadwave? Did I write that down wrong? Love the Dreadwave?
There's just, I think you love.
Oh, I love the Dreadwave. Yeah. Thank you for helping me sort that out. So yes, I love the Dreadwave because of all these stacking arpeggiations that you have in there. It's a very satisfying musical event in that piece.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Loved it.
This is the most embarrassing thing I can ever say as a composer.
Okay.
But I'm going to blame it on a long production schedule. As I made that and threw it up into the project and I was like, kind of, here's the thing. And I forgot about it to the point where I found it and I was like, this is cool. What is this? And I was like, oh, I think I made this. And had to dig around in the project. And it felt really good. But that's the thing. I think this shows like what video game production is like. And the long schedule is one thing, but just that I'm writing so much music and that can happen as I'm kind of jamming on things and something cool like that will happen. I'm not quite sure what it's going to be used for yet. And then I'll make it into a chunk and send it off and be like, hey, what do you think of this? And then I move on to the next thing that I have to write. And so, that was a fun one because I had completely forgotten I had written it. And it's one of my favorite parts too, because I did get to come back and you're like, you know, well, not bad.
You're like impressed with yourself and not knowing it's yourself. Okay, like,
yes. It was, the forgetting I had done it gave me the perspective to like, I think fully appreciate or not, you know, and go, well, that's pretty cool. Whereas usually I don't have that perspective. I'm like, I have no idea if this is good or not.
Right.
Because I spend so much time with it.
Yep.
Yeah. And then several years later, then was like, okay, this is really cool. Now make it work in the game. And so it had that period of like revisiting and rearranging to make it something more useful than what it was, which was just like this short loop of the arpeggiating synth.
Okay. Yeah. Loved that. There's like every once in a while, you know, for various reasons, a video game will have just some random track on it, whether it's you walk into a store and you hear the jingle and so it's just kind of anachronistic to the rest of the score, right? Yeah. And I felt that way a little bit about Brine Sea Scouts. Can you talk to me about that track?
Yeah. Let's talk about that one.
There's like weird trumpet ensemble stuff, which is phenomenally good, and some great woodwind flourishes. But then there's like recorder. I swear to God. So
I'm almost like, can I talk about this without spoiling something?
Oh, no. Okay.
There's a lot of lot comes and goes when you're working on a project for 10 years. And you have this, this is going to be in the game for sure, and this isn't. So Brine Sea Scouts is kind of a remnant of some mythology that was part of the game at the time. It still is the mythology of the game, but isn't, I'd say, actively portrayed as a major part of the game as it was originally intended. But what this was this is, and the reason it's called Brine Sea Scouts is this was the training. This is like the new trainees who are coming to learn how to fly a jet. This is kind of their theme. And again, talking about the weird references we have, we were thinking about Wes Anderson movies.
Oh
and
God.
Moonrise Kingdom.
Okay.
And so we were thinking of like, well, what's kind of naive and kind of charming and youthful and optimistic, and yeah, did I say naive? Naive already. And so that was it. And the instrumentation and the flourishes and the way they're played is kind of supposed to reflect that, that optimism of not childhood, but yeah, trainees. We're like, hey, I'm new here.
Yeah.
What's gonna happen before you're the grizzled veteran.
Yep.
So yeah, I think very different from the rest. In fact, to the point where for the soundtrack, we were like, well, we both really, really love this, but it's very different than everything else. How does it work? And we just kind of said, screw it. It's
Good.
there. We're
I'm
good.
glad you did.
Yeah.
It definitely made me like do a sideways thing as I was listening.
Yeah.
I'm like, really? What's going on with this track? It was great though. Great. Yeah.
Thank you. But yeah, and so that's emblematic of one of the really fortunate things I got to do with this project, and which was so great working with Super Brothers, was these explorations were part of making the game. It wasn't, here's the scene, now make it work over and over. It was like, hey, we have this vague idea. And as Patrick and Craig developed ideas, I got to do the same. And we got to bounce things back and forth in that way. And this is, in the early days of this game, I was the sound designer as well, and was doing everything. So we would experiment with concepts of sound design, creature noises, everything. Like, what could this be? What could that be? And so that's where things like this pop up, is we can just work with some words. We basically, and these scouts, and they're coming to their new camp to learn how to jet. What do you think of that? Wes Anderson, Moonrise Kingdom. And that's what pops out. Whereas, it would be very different if it was some completed scene and they're just like, well, make this work.
Yeah. Right.
Which isn't bad. That's the way most things are. But, was really fortunate with this project, to the point where I do feel like we kind of bent game scenes and gameplay around some of these musical ideas. Like, well, let's make this longer, or this is not the case, but this is the kind of thing. It's like, let's add more people to the choir because it sounds so cool.
Yeah.
And so then they have to go back to the game and add more people to the scene or whatever. I don't think that actually happened, but that kind of thing. This back and forth really allows for that sort of experimentation.
Yeah. And 10 years, huh? How did that happen in the very beginning? How did you get connected with the project?
I just posted on Twitter about one of the first things, but yeah, we just kind of mutual appreciation. I didn't know much about video games, but Super Brothers was on the tail end of Sword and Sorcery, and I had heard about it vaguely, and they got in touch through a friend. We're like, hey, would you be interested in doing a little bit of something for this game? And this friend who was more into games than I was said, I ran it by him. I was like, have you heard of Sword and Sorcery? He's like, oh shit, yeah. Why? And I was like, well, they asked if I wanted to do some little sound design thing for it. And that friend was like, do it. Like, this is, everybody's talking about this game. It's really exciting. So I started out doing just a few bits, because obviously Jim Guthrie was the prime composer on Sword and Sorcery. But it came out and was kind of like a hit. So they said, hey, come to GDC, Game Developers Convention, and we can meet in person, just kind of, have dinner or whatever.
Yeah.
So I was at some party at GDC, and I met Doug Wilson from Die Gute Fabrik. I think he's an educator now somewhere in Australia. But I met him at a party. He's like, yeah, and I really like that game you're doing with Craig. It's really cool. And I was like, well, what game? I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, oh, he showed me the demo? And I'm like, I do not know what game you're talking about. So he's like, okay, well, this is a little weird. And then I asked Craig, I said, yeah, well, I met Doug Wilson. He was saying that he really likes your new demo, but my music. And Craig was like, oh yeah, well, Patrick and I went to Toronto Game Jam, to Toe Jam, and we made a little, Game Jam game, and we used some of your music off of one of your records. He was like, I hope that's okay. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's awesome. So I was already in this game. I had no clue what it was, but it was at a game jam, the very first kind of iteration of what became JETT.
Okay.
And that had some of my music in it, which was from the early days of me making music, which was a lot of sample-based stuff. So that song is in the game, but it had to, recreate it from scratch to avoid sample issues. And it's very different. It ended up in a very different place. And this is actually something on the soundtrack I was really insistent about, was having some sound design appear. And it is very spacious. So I took the chords. It's a WC. It's a WC composition that has been made and remade several times. So I just kind of lifted chords from it and was like, well, these are neat, and turned it into, again, something totally different.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was in the original demo, this old sampled tune. And yeah, remind me and I can send you the genesis of it and then what it became for the game.
Oh, sweet. Yeah.
So that's fun too, is that original thing made it all the way into the final game in some form. Again, scared of legal issues, but then it turned out to not even, we didn't basically use none of it. Nobody would ever know kind of thing. But it still became something really, really, really cool. But yeah, that is one, the original song that I did was called Saints of Infinity. So my brain is just like Saints. And that did not end up being the final title. But I can look it up.
Okay.
So that's how it started.
Wow.
And then it was even another year after that or so, because Craig was still finishing Sword and Sorcery, in terms of they were adding some content, bug fixes, new, I think, platforms and all that kind of stuff. So we didn't really get going till 2013 was when Craig was like, okay, back to that. Remember that game I talked to you about a few years ago? Let's actually do it. And I was like, okay. And it was my first, the first game I worked on, really.
Wow.
And first full score that I signed on for. So it's extra ironic that it took so long for it to actually come out. Yeah.
Yeah, it did. Just keeping in mind that I still want to talk to you about Gibbon.
Yes.
And I hope that's okay. But before we do that, and first of all, before we leave JETT, period, I want to know if there's anything else you want to say about it before we move on.
Let's see. This even sounds like a plug, but it's totally not. That there's more to the game to come. That was just announced last week, and there's more new music involved in that. New, I say. It's, again, this is music that's been floating around for years. A lot of it for me in various forms. So yeah, I'm really excited about that there's kind of this part 1 and part 2 to what this ended up as, because we didn't know when we started what the heck was going to happen. There was even at one point, we even experimented with VR for a minute to what would this be like as a VR game? And so yeah, a lot of experimentation with that. So yeah, I think that's the last thing to say is I really am excited. There's kind of this next chapter to what people get to experience, especially for something that took us so long. It's fun to not just be like, okay, it's done. Whew. There's something about here's part of it, and we got more to look forward to. Is really, really exciting.
And I imagine you'll release that at some point as well, the soundtrack.
Yes, 100% sure. I think, again, Super Brothers are very forward thinking, and I do believe we even have it planned, track listing and everything is already kind of ready to go, and we're just waiting on, all the beta testing, bug fixing stuff and proper release schedule, and then it'll probably come out in tandem with the second part of the game.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
And now before we go to Gibbon, you mentioned a little bit about kind of your musical background and going to school for industrial design, which
Yeah.
is interesting. And so then at what point did you pivot to just doing music, quote unquote, right?
Slowly. So I got a design degree and just played music for fun. And then in amongst those design clients, I was doing a lot of music work. So CD covers and album covers for friends' bands and friends' record labels and whatnot. And one of those clients then who owned a record label then got a job at Microsoft and was like, oh, do you want to make music for this thing you're doing the design for anyway? It's like, cool. I guess. So I did that. And then another friend got into commercial directing and asked me if I wanted to do a Volkswagen commercial. So I kind of faded or segued from visual graphic design stuff into music for advertising and film. And so when video game stuff came up, I was ready for it. So when Super Brothers got in touch, or another one of my early jobs was doing some remixes for Crackdown 2 for Microsoft. And that was through Guy Whitmore, the audio director at the time for Microsoft Game Studios, had just seen me play live. Whitmore. Yeah. You do? Yeah. Guy's great.
What a wonderful, fantastic fella. Yeah.
Yeah. We're neighbors. We met at our local coffee shop. Yeah.
Oh my God. If you see him and you think of it, please tell him hello for me. I would love that.
I will, for sure. No, yeah. So that was one of the first things I had done. So I was roughly ready for it. Like I knew production techniques, mixing, all that stuff. The unfamiliar territory was doing adaptive. I think this is a Guy Whitmore term, adaptive music. So as music changes based on player progression or input or changes within the game, that was new, but I kind of jumped into that because I was very familiar with performing live with Ableton Live. So kind of,
oh, nice.
I have a rough idea of what I want to do, but I will change things in process of a live performance depending on how I think things should go. And actually one of my earliest jobs, that's how I demoed. I went in with 17-bit to work on Gades. I was like, this is what I imagine the music doing. And I brought a laptop and a Novation Launchpad. Was like, I think, and this is when the enemies come, and I kind of change Ableton scenes and then this can fade out if you win. And
cool.
So yeah, kind of translated that into video games. So I hit the ground running in terms of I already had a lot of the skills necessary to do the basics, technical basics. And then that segued from the film and TV stuff into video games pretty almost full time. I haven't done anything non-video gaming for a while. So
okay. And I got the impression you're not really a gamer.
I am. I was not when I got the first offer.
Okay.
I had an Xbox and I played a fair amount of Halo 2 way back.
Okay.
But I wasn't super avid and was really unfamiliar kind of with the indie explosion that surrounded Sword and Sorcery.
Yeah.
But then jumped right in. And so I was like, holy shit, there's some incredible stuff happening. And a lot of it reminded me of playing punk rock when I was a kid. So it was really exciting and fun to get to be a part of that. So it came up quick. As quickly as I could. And when night school approached me, I believe that was through a friend of a friend. Yeah, it was through a friend of a friend. So Sean Krankel at night school got in touch, not knowing I had worked in video games. It's just I love your music. That
cool.
My friend has your CD in his car. Would you be interested in working on games? I was like, I already am. Let's do this.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Hopefully we'll have a part 2 discussion and we can talk about the night school projects because
I'd love to.
People love that music, rightfully so. It's amazing. It's fantastic. But instead of those, we're talking Gibbons next. Gibbon Beyond the Trees came out earlier this year, 2022. And it's a brief but lovely game about, deforestation. You're probably going to cry, but the music is fantastic. So talk to me about, shifting gears big time. At least in this episode, because certainly you had more time to adjust. But what it was like working on Gibbon.
Yeah, well, it was fantastic, and I do think these are great kind of case studies because of that contrast. Because it does really highlight something that's really important to me, is that I don't go into a project as me. I'm going to make scientific music, tough shit. I like every project. I really dig into as much as I can and as early as I can. So it's important to me. The most important thing I'm doing is helping make whatever thing I'm contributing to good. And that means like understanding the vision that came before I was involved and the vision of the people I'm collaborating with. So I started working with Broken Rules on Old Man's Journey, and I had met Clemens at, I think, again, a PAX. I think maybe, Jake from 17-Bit introduced me to Clemens on the street. And then the next day, the 17-Bit booth was across from the Broken Rules booth. And so I was like, oh, holy shit. Oh, you make this game that was Secrets of Redicon. And I was like, this looks amazing. Just beautiful visual art. And they literally put a call on Twitter like, hey, we're looking for composers and sound designers. Wow. And they did an open call and blind audition for Old Man's Journey. So I was like, oh, I want to do this. Here's what I think. And then I think maybe they narrowed it down to have, I don't know, a few people, 20 people or 10 or something, do demos. And so I did demos. They listened to those blind, and then they selected mine. And then it's just been a great collaboration on every project I've done with them. I think we get along in a lot of ways, culturally and politically. So we kind of get each other. And then for Gibbon, it really became clear in process, like how important it was, this game. Like it started, the genesis was, it's fun to swing around in trees. Hey, being a Gibbon, that's fun. But then they really did, and being such good and responsible people, they looked into this and were like, oh, there's actually a lot of nuance to being a Gibbon, I guess you'd say. And that is like species endangerment, territory encroachment, mostly because of palm oil farming, so deforestation based on that. And so it quickly collided with sort of significant important issues that were already important to us, but really came to light. And what started as, hey, we'll make this fun thing. And so they didn't pivot at all from what the game was, but definitely put in focus on those important issues. So doing interviews and talking with environmentalists about the specifics, making sure we were covering everything appropriately and getting all the important stuff in there, and how then do we then take that and weave it into this fun game and make it an engaging story and a fun thing for people to play, but also engage with, kind of on that social and cultural level. And they did a bang up job. So it becomes then very difficult, like, oh, this is a tall order. Like, this is an important thing to make as good as possible. And again, so that's that thing of like, the number one thing here is making whatever the project is as good as I can possibly make it. And a big part of that is I come in as blind as possible with respect to what I'm going to use to create.
Okay.
So that's why I think if you look at everything I've done, there's really wide variety. And I'm not an expert at any of them, but I'm pretty good at a lot of stuff. But the way I get pretty good at it is just going like, well, what's their vibe? And I'm going to steal as much of that as I can, which is good because that's, that's the collaborative process. And so I'm I'm stealing ideas, but I'm stealing them from the people I'm working with, and I'm stealing concepts from, concept art or animation, and saying, well, what's that like musically? And, crafting that into something that hopefully is very unique to that project.
Mm-hmm.
And thus, makes the whole thing kind of a more cohesive whole, as opposed to like, well, here's this story about gibbons with beautiful art and then some weird ass tones that Scientific made that don't make any sense. So that's why I end up with different things, is because I start with as blank a canvas as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with Gibbon, I really loved all of the like struck toned instruments like marimbas and even like tuned drums and chimes. What were some of the other ones? A dulcimer? Was there dulcimer sample in there? Okay, yeah. Just all these things that are hit to make a sound.
Yes.
So talk to me about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was kind of thinking about, I wanted to reflect the area and the habitat of the animal, but I also want to be culturally sensitive. I don't want to just go, okay, well, we'll just make this like Balinese, we'll make a gamelan thing, and I don't know anything about it, but whatever. Gibbons. I want to make something that is evocative, but in a more abstract way. So it's not as literal, like we're just going to make the music that comes from that place, because it's not about that place. Actually, it's about the animals. The most important thing in this is gibbons. And then the secondary thing is how humans have intervened on their habitat. And it's really not the people from those areas. I'm going to get a little on my high horse here, but it is primarily Western interests, but it is corporate money interests that are driving all of this. And you see this almost everywhere in the world. If there's a problem or environmental devastation, you can just follow the trail of money back somewhere, and it's never good. And so how do I reflect that musically? Well, I was like, well, I want a voice that's not, it's evocative of the jungle and the environment and the gibbons. What is that? And then wanted to contrast this is kind of like JETT, but wanted to contrast that with, well, the invader. And so I did kind of the same thing. It's like the invasive species, which is humans. This is the orchestral stuff and Western tunings that we're familiar with. So when we really feel that encroaching on this environment, that's what's taking over. But when it is that environment and the joy of the gibbons, that is these percussive elements, which I think is just like, there's something percussive, that's more buoyant and bouncy and reflective of the way gibbons move, brachiate, which is the official term I've learned, and even their communication, which again, I know you mentioned on Twitter, wobbler sound being involved. They did an amazing job of collecting the vocal samples of gibbons and using that to enhance communication in the game. So yeah, there's just these feelings of like, well, that's what I want to express, is the jungle of that's native to the species. So I did a ton of research for music genres and instrumentation from that region, and did found within it there is a lot of percussive. There's bamboo, it's simply what we would call marimba. There's tuned drums, tabla terang, which you see not just in India, but you do see in Malaysia and other areas. But then I spread it broader, so there's instruments from all over the world, and one of the prime ones is essentially, I think the closest relative would be a hung drum. So it's a tuned metal. It's like the end of a propane tank that has tongues cut in it.
Oh,
that's the main instrument. It's here somewhere that I played, and that is a cultural kind of like mutt. So that's like it's kind of like steel drums in Jamaica.
Yep. Oh yeah,
that's like
pan
those are
drums
oil
or
drums.
Yeah.
that have been manipulated into this amazing, amazing instrument. So these are kind of the same. And so what I found was I was collecting all these different instruments that had this general vibe, but that vibe became very almost like international because of where things were pulling from. And that I in turn made it funner to just like, oh, I'm going to express like, the Gibbon world, whatever that is. And it really, really helps make it contrast with more overt, like I said, human intervention stuff, which I based on, Western, like orchestral stuff like strings.
Yeah, and you did mention the tunings too, because I mean, right away in the very first track of Gibbon, you hear some quarter tone stuff, right? And I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, we're mostly Western, but there's it's kind of what the instruments are gonna do. And some just are like, okay, well that's not right, but right, I say. That also gets back to one choice that was made was to keep mostly Western tuning. But this gets back to what I was talking about with JETT and the difference between, the human side and the alien side is like trying to come to grips with, even within different human cultures, how differently we accept what is supposed to be normal. And so like Western chromatic tuning versus tuning from like gamelan's actually a good example of this is just a different tuning method. From one tone to the next. And so to us, we think, oh, that's exotic and, different. And to me, but to someone who's like, hears gamelan all the time, they don't, every time they hear it, like go, wow, that's weird and exotic. They're just like, that's music. That's music. So it was keeping that in mind with this as well. But it was, mostly Western tuning just because that's what most of the instruments are. And then that fade from one thing to the other, and to express, we knew, and this is another thing, is knowing the audience, that it will be primarily a Western audience. And so if I want to express joy and sadness, like the easiest way to do that is with things that, the typical or average player would be more familiar with.
Sure. And
easier to kind of accept when, at the end, there's kind of an uplifting moment that's like, well, we're going from minor to major now. Done.
Yeah. And, that was one key point I wanted to mention about JETT too, that I really enjoyed all the major chords, to be honest. There's a lot of positivity in that music, and I think maybe that's, because it's exploration and you're out there and you're like starting these new things and trying, but I really liked that tone in JETT. And of course it's very present here as well, because the game is so, gleeful in a lot of ways, just the act of swinging through the trees. It is fun, you're just like banging around up there.
Yeah.
It's great. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's actually, in being a composer, that was one of the hardest things I did was early on trying to write anything in a major key. I was just like, ugh, why would I do this? Like minor, like sad stuff, so much easier. Yeah. Getting comfortable with it to the point where I'm at now, I'm actually, I'm glad you say that, because I'm like, oh yeah, I am finally comfortable with that.
Yeah.
But and given you hear that in the very, intro tones of the game, here's the metaphor here is those, we're using the different instruments as call and response from Gibbons. So they're not based on tones Gibbons make, but that general idea of the dun, 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 and then you hear it somewhere else is that's them talking to each other from treetop to treetop. And when they come together, that's when it gets, harmonious and progresses and starts to swing around.
It definitely does get serious, of course, because of the, like you were talking about with the palm oil and all of the environmental consequences for these amazing creatures. And in Embers, there is a spot, it's pretty much halfway through the track. It's like I don't know how long the track is, but about halfway through the track, you bring in this really low bass slide. And it's really the first time we hear that frequency, I feel like, in contrast to the other kind of high frequencies that you hear from hitting something, right?
Yeah.
So I just loved it. I know visually what's going on in the game right there. So, you know, when you know that, it kind of makes sense. But I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about that addition.
Yeah. So one of the experiments I did, it's actually in frame here, the cello hanging there was, I have no clue how to play that thing, but I love the way they sound, and I'm really into sounds that are more than just what you typically think of performance of a cello to be. Like hitting them, that, you know, the resonance on that thing, or on cellos in general, is very cool. So I actually bought that to experiment with. So like tuning the strings by sticking a drumstick in there, and then, you know, tapping on the shell and whatnot. But one of the things I was doing was, there's a specific sound I wanted in this soundtrack that is, well, most of the percussive stuff is live. There's a lot of live instrumentation in this, but the string stuff, you know, again, I want orchestral stuff. I don't know how to do it. We don't have the budget to do a big orchestra, so I'm using samples. But there was a specific thing I wanted to do, which was slide into notes. And that I couldn't find in any sample libraries, so that I performed myself. Cool. And then there was a counter or a parallel instrument to that, which is synthetic. Synthetic is the sound you're mentioning, the like kind of very low. But I like that parallel of, like, we get these kind of scoops in, and then this is this, you know, descending. And I think it's an accident that it is frequency content wise so different than everything else.
Okay.
But everybody loves that sound. And it was like, oh yeah, that's really cool. And it really worked.
Oh, it's so effective.
Element of the game. So that is one more kind of sort of, you know, artificially thing that made it in. But again, mixing, and it just kind of worked its way in. And I feel at least that it matches. Yeah.
And I had started to say earlier about one of my favorite things about Gibbon, when you're building these layers, because in the game itself, there's, you know, obviously there's a lot of other sound design elements happening, and some of that, sometimes that's rain, sometimes it's like crowd noise of people talking. It's not covering up the music, but it's an element that is separate from it that you don't hear on the soundtrack. And so one of the things that I really enjoyed about the soundtrack was hearing all of these tracks build from their genesis. And, you know, it's probable that they aren't really constructed like that in the game in the first place. I'm not sure, but I really love the standalone soundtrack for that reason, just hearing everything start from the smallest nugget and build into these really cool pieces.
Thank you. Well, it is a conscious decision we made with the mix of the game. Is we wanted the ambiences to be important. So we actually consciously mixed the music in this game lower than is typical.
Okay.
Because that contrast is very important. Verdant, loud, animal-y jungle. That is stripped away, and you hear the burning, and then you hear the machinery, and like, oh, you know, this is really changed to all the fully urban soundscapes of crowds and honking horns and human beings. That's as important in this game as the music is. And so we actually turned the music down a few notches so that stuff could persist and exist. And it is an idea that we haven't acted on yet, but is in the back of our minds, to do Gibbon soundscapes, you know, release. Because I think, again, Wobbler Sound did such a great job of collecting all this.
David and Marcus,
and it's just a fun thing for me. Like, I love soundscapes. I even mentioned one of the earliest things I did for Sword and Sorcery with Super Brothers was a song it's more soundscape than it is actual music. And so when I can get away with that, I do, because I love that. I love hearing rain sounds in a song. It's a total cheat, but it's like instantly transportative. So it's an idea we've batted around with this, was to do a longer form and more environmental ambience focused soundtrack, because there's stuff that didn't necessarily make the soundtrack that is that. I was like, I'm just going to make 15 minutes of, kind of plucks or percussive hits and mix. And so we actually, kind of like I did with the overture for JETT, was I just made 15-minute long things for us to listen to and be like, this is the vibe of the jungle.
Nice.
Where can we work this in where it just doesn't have to be score all the time, and we can just really, reflect on what the jungle sounds like.
Yeah. And then at the end, there's a track called Liberation. I can't remember if Liberation happens during the credits or right before the credits right now off the top of my head, but it gets really synthy at the end, and I love that shit.
Yeah.
It's like this really great like synth bass stuff happening. I mean, not like super duper 80s style, but kind of, I really loved that vibe. Yeah, talk about that one.
Yeah. Sometimes that stuff just works its way in. Like I said, it's like, it's whatever's cool. Whatever's cool. So going back to JETT a little of that, again, that metaphor broke down every once in a while. Actually, Dreadwave is a good example of like, the synths are the planet. But that is really reflective of the, May's journey in that, this is, you're in deep shit. So there is kind of like, we're covering human stuff. And so in that, I'm like, my metaphor, that kind of thing sort of broke down here, but it sounds cool. So fuck it. And so same with this. It's like, in that descending tone you mentioned earlier, it's like, this sounds really neat. Yeah. So it deserves to be in there. And it is a psychological thing for myself. And I don't know whether it's because of my age or what. It's like my brain has always had this huge division. I think because of like 80s synth soundtracks being like, that's low budget. And so it was, people don't remember this because there's been such a revival of it, but it was kind of derogatory. Like nobody was like, John Carpenter rules, man. Everybody was kind of like, these kind of cheesy B movies. And I always loved them, but it took a long time to go like, you know what? Screw that. This shit's amazing. This is like these are some of the best scores that have ever been made. Mm-hmm. Like I'll go to bat for Escape from New York alongside anything. I just think it's incredible. Yeah. But my brain can't get rid of it. And I've even noticed that when collaborating with video game developers of like, I'm like, that sounds, it sounds like an old, 70s thing. And they're like, what? Why? No, it just sounds cool. And so it was me trying to get over like that, if I'm using the Moog, that means it's some retro thing. Yeah. But if I'm using strings, that's the eternal orchestral, everybody, Yeah. So it's getting past that, and I think I am finally to the point where I am like, if that sounds cool, screw it, and that works, and it won't ruin the vibe, hopefully. No. Like, people don't go like, and why did it all of a sudden turn into the like soundtrack to some 70s zombie flick? I don't get it. And just getting used to it as a, more broadly accepted. But I think that is too culturally, like that music has had such a huge comeback that I'm sure most like 17-year-olds hearing it now have no clue what the early 80s were like. Like they don't go, ooh, Knight Rider. They just think like, that's cool. It's Carpenter Brute. They're awesome.
Yeah. Knight Rider has made a weird reappearance in my life lately, and I've so much so that I've been watching it again, which, I mean, I don't remember. I watched it when I was a kid, because I was born in the 70s, so I watched it when I was a kid, but I don't, I didn't like grow up remembering my favorite Knight Rider episode or anything like that. And so I just got really curious one night, a couple weeks back. I had finished up a series I'd been watching for a long time, and I was like, I just need something like, I kind of want something nostalgic and semi-mindless. And I put on the pilot or the first episode, and I was just like, this is the origin story of this show. I was just like blown away. And then I was just sucked in. I'm like, well, everything about this is my childhood, the shoddy storytelling, the terrible stunts, the like all the stuff. But yet, it's so great. Yeah. Knight Rider. I just can't believe you brought up Knight Rider. But one thing I do love the most about rewatching that is the soundtrack. The score for that show is really fun. Yeah. I was pleasantly surprised by that.
It's a different era, but I came across something, not childhood, but something from way in the past that really kind of blew my mind. I'm not sure in a not a, hey, this is amazing way, but just like the kind of experimentation that used to go on is a TV. I believe this is the early 90s show called Unsub. And so it was one of the guys from Starsky and Hutch is the star. But it was basically like CSI before CSI existed.
Okay.
So it was like kind of this genius, like gritty. Criminal Minds. It's like Criminal Minds. They follow a serial killer, and like we're gonna get in the mind of this like awful person. So it was very dark. But the thing that really, blew me away about it is, and I think is it Mike Snow, whoever the composer who like absolutely kills it with like every Law and Order,
X-Files and that guy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Snow.
Yes.
What's his last name?
Mike Post. Post.
Yep. Thank you. Yes, Mike Post. It is the weirdest soundtrack I've ever heard.
Neat.
And I'm like, what is going on? Like the show's very dark.
Okay.
Really grim subject matter. One of the kind of CSI guys, gets into the mind of the killer and it gets very weird. But then the music's totally bizarre, and it's like they would never make this show today. It's just too out there in terms of polished. It's very rough around the edges, but it has that kind of like, because they didn't have the budget for reshoots or whatever. So they went with what they could get together. But I was like, hats off to them and the composer for, probably one of the most recognizable themes ever.
Right.
Dun, 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 doing this weird thing amidst that. And it's like a Stephen Cannell production or something. So it's from the people who were making the network hits, but boy, is it weird. It only lasted a year, but then
I see that. I'm like looking.
Proof they're all on YouTube. I found them.
Oh God, I'm definitely this is right up my alley. This is fabulous.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it only lasted a year. But then again, like America, they were just ahead of their time. Like a few years later, I don't know how long later, but CSI and then Criminal Minds, like we're really like, okay, this is what that show was that, failed. Cool. We'll do it again.
Love it.
Anyway, it was quite a divergence into.
Because of the synthy bass.
Yes.
Synthy bass will do that to you. Yeah.
So unfortunately, I can't claim that as an influence because I only discovered that like a year ago. But I think going back to John Carpenter is the most obvious influence, not just on me, on so many people, but it has been really fun to watch this total cultural reassessment of everything he did.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's got a famous quote. I forget exactly, but it's something like, in America, I'm a bum, but in France, I'm an auteur, or something like that. Or he's talking about like what everybody thinks of him. So he's also very aware of that. But if you didn't know, he scored the new Halloween movie. So he's back. He collaborates with his son.
Amazing.
And so he didn't direct the new one, but he did the score.
Okay.
So I'm very excited for that.
I saw that Jamie's back for that one. Jamie Lee Curtis is back for that one as well.
So. Oh, is she? Yeah.
Yep. She's in it. Yep. Oh, man, that one scared me so much just because it was one of the few horror movies I had seen at that point because I wasn't really into horror. Still am not, but where, he's just like walking around in the middle of the day. It was like scary things happening in the daytime in that movie. And I was like, no, it's only supposed to happen at night. I'm not safe during the day anymore. Yeah, that's so good, though. Oh, cool. Well, I'll look forward to that. I will look forward to that. Well, let me see. I know I had a couple more thoughts about Gibbon quickly. You did mention that, as the Gibbon, back to Gibbon land, Gibbon gets into the industrialized world, the palette changes a little bit. And I thought that was a really cool touch as well. There is an instrument in New World, and this is so embarrassing to even ask this, but it kind of sounds like piano. And I'm like, is that a piano? Because why would I ask, is that a piano? But I'm asking if that's a piano.
So if it's the thing I'm thinking of that you're mentioning, So I'm glad you brought this up. This is the thing I'm proud of. This is like low budget, very low budget thing. But one thing I really like doing, and this kind of relates to the instrumentation for this game as a whole, is when I pull different samples together to create something that is slightly less the constituents. So it's exactly that. And so instead of it's a piano thing, it's like my hope is that it's different enough that it's like gives people kind of an off balance feeling about it, but can concentrate then more on like the melody of it and not just immediately fall into it's piano. And it's totally cheap and cheesy the way I do it. It's just layers in contact of different things. So maybe some piano, like hammered dulcimer or dulcitone, Fender Rhodes, any of these things layered together. And it's still going to be, most of the time it works best with percussive instruments. Sure. Then it becomes its kind of own thing. It doesn't exist anywhere else. Yeah. But it's just a couple contact instruments piled on top of each other. This is probably my biggest musical dirty secret, is that this is a thing I love to do. The best example of that is I did a series of interactive children's books.
Oh, cool.
So on Bandcamp, it's the one that's called Odd Fool at Luna. So it's 3 children's books. But listening through that, I did a lot with making fake instruments, but they're just by combining other things that do exist.
Cool. And
I got to do that again. So I did one track on Sarah Northway's new game. I was a teenage exocolonist. Okay. And so when we discussed kind of the creative direction for that game, she mentioned specifically, she was like, I love that stuff. I love that the children's books stuff. I was like, well, that's awesome, because I love it too, and it would be something really fun to revisit. So I went back and kind of went through that archive of instruments and did a new song in that, like, style, and got to, again, create some sort of an instrument that is familiar and very organic, but isn't instantly like that's a piano or a Rhodes.
Yeah. Neat. I love that. Yeah, it was very effective in making me very curious, Yeah. Yeah, I loved that. Well, Andy, good Lord, what else do you want to say about these two? Because I swear we're going to do this again in a few months.
Yeah, we should.
I have time. Yeah.
No, I think that really covered it. I didn't have notes about important things, but I think you asked the right questions to get to those things. Yeah, like that. The contrast, like, why do I do things that are so different? We covered that. The fun little dichotomy that both have. They were good. Yeah, they were good ones to compare and contrast.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed doing those deep dives on both those. And, I know you've got more coming up. Probably you can't talk about anything, can you? Can you talk about anything you're working on right now?
No, but when the time comes, absolutely yes. So if you want to do this again, it has to go through the more official channels of my current employer. Okay. But they would love for me to do this again and get in depth with.
Great.
I think, the next thing will be Oxenfree 2. So
beautiful. That's next year, right? Just 2023.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just announced a delay, but it's a good delay because we're really getting to craft what we want to craft.
I usually consider a delay. Well, I guess it depends on the developer. Depending on the developer, I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. You should just take all the time you need to make this perfect, or as close to it. Then I guess there are other developers you're like,
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, that'll be exciting to have that come out. Can't say I'll be brave enough to play it, but we'll see. So we'll see. I get pretty spooked by stuff like that. So.
All right. Yeah, but so far so good.
Good.
I'm very proud of it. I think it hews closely to, what people want from a sequel to a game that a lot of people really know.
Yep.
So yeah.
Great.
And for sure, we can make the connections and make that happen, because I'd love to I love to talk about that game. There's a
Awesome.
lot of fun stuff to
Good.
talk about. So.
Good. All right, Andy. Well, thank you so much for all your time today. That was really generous of you to let me ask so many questions about two separate projects. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, great questions. This has been a fantastic interview. So thank you.